Something about the Mercedes engine after the Australian Grand Prix has the entire Formula One paddock on edge. Because the very first race of the 2026 season ended with a dominant Mercedes 1-2. George Russell won the race. Kimi Antonelli finished right behind him. But only hours after that victory, engineers from rival teams began analyzing the race telemetry from Melbourne. And what they found in the data was completely unexpected. Acceleration bursts that looked stronger than anything else on the grid. Energy deployment patterns that appeared far more aggressive than rival engines. And performance spikes that some analysts believe could be worth nearly 30 extra horsepower in certain moments of the lap. 30 horsepower. In Formula One, that kind of advantage can decide an entire championship. Ferrari has already admitted they were nowhere near the pace of the Mercedes in Australia. Red Bull finished more than 50 seconds behind the leaders. And now the FIA has started taking a closer look at the data coming from the Mercedes power unit. Because if that performance advantage comes from a hidden interpretation of the new 2026 engine regulations, the entire balance of power in Formula One could change before the next race even begins. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the data from the Australian Grand Prix has triggered serious questions inside the FIA. And why the Mercedes engine might already be the most controversial technology of the new Formula One era. At first, the Australian Grand Prix looked like the perfect start to the new Formula One era for Mercedes. Everything went right for them in Melbourne. George Russell started from pole position. Kimi Antonelli lined up right beside him on the front row. And even though the race began with a small surprise, the final result still ended exactly how Mercedes hoped. Because when the lights went out, both Mercedes drivers actually struggled at the start. Charles Leclerc reacted faster and jumped into the lead at the first corner. For several laps, Ferrari looked like a real threat. Russell and Leclerc fought wheel to wheel, exchanging positions while testing the limits of the new hybrid system introduced in 2026. Every time Russell activated the new overtake mode, the Mercedes suddenly surged forward. The acceleration looked incredibly strong. But every attack came with a price. Using that extra electrical power drained the battery quickly, leaving Russell vulnerable once the energy level dropped. That created a fascinating rhythm in the opening laps. Attack, defend, recharge, then attack again. It was the first clear demonstration of how the new energy regulations have changed the way drivers fight on track. But hidden inside that battle was something engineers would later notice in the data. Every time the Mercedes deployed its electrical energy, the car seemed to gain slightly more acceleration than its rivals. Not dramatically more, but enough to raise eyebrows once the telemetry was analyzed later. At that moment during the race, however, it still looked like a normal fight between two top teams. Then the race reached the moment that changed everything. A virtual safety car was triggered after the Red Bull of Isaac Hadjar stopped on track with a mechanical problem. And Mercedes reacted instantly. Both Russell and Antonelli entered the pit lane at the same time. A perfectly executed double pit stop under the virtual safety car. That decision turned the race in their favor. Ferrari stayed out on track. But when the race restarted, Russell suddenly had something extremely valuable. Clean air ahead of him. And that is when the real pace of the Mercedes became impossible to ignore. Lap after lap, Russell began controlling the race from the front. He did not need to push aggressively. The car looked balanced, stable, and extremely efficient when managing energy and tire wear. Behind him, Antonelli began climbing back through the field after his difficult start. Within a few laps, the young Italian had recovered enough positions to secure second place. By the final phase of the race, the picture was clear. Russell leading comfortably. Antonelli protecting second place. Ferrari unable to close the gap. The race ended with a dominant Mercedes 1-2 finish. A perfect result in the first race of the 2026 season. For Mercedes, it looked like the ideal beginning to a championship campaign. But while the team celebrated in Melbourne, something very different was happening in the garages of their rivals. Because engineers had already started studying the telemetry from the race. Every acceleration zone. Every deployment of electrical energy. Every moment where the Mercedes gained time. And once those numbers were compared with the data from Ferrari and Red Bull, one question began spreading quietly across the paddock. How is the Mercedes engine producing acceleration like that under the new regulations? And the next part of this story reveals the specific data that engineers believe could explain why the Mercedes power unit suddenly looks so powerful in the new era of Formula One. But once the race finished in Melbourne, the real story was only beginning. Because inside every Formula One garage, the work does not stop when the checkered flag falls. That is when the engineers open the data. Every lap, every sector, every moment where one car gains even the smallest advantage. And when teams started comparing the telemetry from the Australian Grand Prix, something unusual began to appear in the numbers coming from the Mercedes. Not in the top speed. Not in the cornering performance. The biggest difference appeared in the short acceleration phases. Those critical moments when the driver exits a slow corner and the hybrid system releases electrical energy to push the car forward. At Albert Park, those moments happen again and again throughout the lap. And every time the Mercedes reached those points, the acceleration curve looked slightly stronger than the rest of the grid. Just a small advantage. A few hundredths of a second here. Another small gain there. But when that pattern repeats 10, 12, 15 times per lap, the result becomes impossible to ignore. Over an entire race distance, those tiny gains turn into a serious performance gap. That is exactly what some engineers believe happened in Melbourne. Once George Russell moved into clean air after the virtual safety car pit stop, the Mercedes was able to control the pace of the race without pushing the car to its absolute limit. The advantage was not explosive. It was controlled, efficient, and incredibly consistent. Some analysts inside the paddock now believe the Mercedes power unit may have delivered nearly 30 extra horsepower during certain acceleration phases. 30 horsepower may not sound dramatic outside Formula One, but inside the sport, it is enormous. Even 10 additional horsepower can completely change the balance between two teams. 30 horsepower can transform the competitive order of the entire grid. That possibility is exactly why the FIA has now begun looking more closely at the performance data from the Australian Grand Prix. Not because Mercedes has been accused of breaking the rules, but because the numbers coming from the W17 are simply too interesting to ignore. And when rival teams started speaking after the race, their reactions made the situation even more intriguing. Ferrari openly admitted they were surprised by the performance of the Mercedes. Charles Leclerc said after qualifying that Ferrari was nowhere near the pace of the W17. Not just slightly behind. Far behind. He even suggested that most of the difference seemed to come from the engine. That statement alone immediately caught the attention of engineers across the paddock. Because Ferrari is one of the few teams that builds its own power unit. If Ferrari believes another engine has a clear advantage, it usually means the difference is real. Red Bull also struggled to match the Mercedes pace in Australia. Max Verstappen finished 6th in the race, more than 50 seconds behind the winning Mercedes. For a team that dominated previous seasons, that result was a serious warning. But here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because in modern Formula One, the biggest performance advantages rarely come from a single mechanical part. They come from interpretation. From understanding the regulations better than anyone else. Sometimes a team finds a clever way to use the rules that others simply did not see. And when that happens, the rest of the grid has two choices. Catch up. Or ask the FIA to take a closer look. Right now, it seems both things are happening at the same time. Because while rival teams are already trying to understand how Mercedes achieved this level of performance, the FIA is carefully reviewing the data from the Australian Grand Prix. And depending on what they discover, the story of the 2026 season could be only just beginning. But what makes this situation even more interesting is what other teams started saying after the race. Because the reaction from Ferrari and Red Bull revealed something very important about the balance of power at the start of the new era. Ferrari, in particular, did not hide its surprise. Charles Leclerc spoke openly after qualifying and admitted that Ferrari was nowhere near the pace of the Mercedes in Australia. Not just a little behind. A big gap. He explained that even if Ferrari had executed the perfect lap in qualifying, the difference to the Mercedes would still have been significant. And according to Leclerc, most of that difference seemed to come from the power unit performance. That statement immediately raised eyebrows inside the paddock. Because Ferrari is not just another team. Ferrari builds its own engine. If Ferrari engineers believe another manufacturer has found a major advantage in the power unit, that is something the entire grid pays attention to. Red Bull's reaction was slightly more cautious, but the message was still clear. Max Verstappen admitted after the race that the RB22 is not the fastest car right now. He explained that the team still has a lot of work to do if they want to fight for victories in this new regulation era. For a team that dominated previous seasons, that kind of statement says a lot. Because finishing 6th in the opening race, more than 50 seconds behind the winning Mercedes, is not where Red Bull expected to be. And that result has forced engineers inside the team to start asking the same question everyone else in the paddock is asking. What exactly has Mercedes discovered inside the new engine regulations? Some analysts now believe the answer could be linked to how the Mercedes power unit manages electrical deployment during short acceleration phases. The 2026 regulations increased the importance of electrical energy in the total power output of the engine. which means the timing of energy deployment has become one of the most critical elements of performance. If one team finds a way to release that energy more efficiently, even for just a fraction of a second, the advantage can become enormous across an entire lap. That idea is supported by what engineers observed in the data from the Australian Grand Prix. The Mercedes appeared extremely strong when exiting slow corners. Those short acceleration zones where electrical deployment is most important. Instead of delivering power in a long continuous wave, the Mercedes seemed to release it in precise bursts. Short, powerful pulses of acceleration exactly when the driver needed them. That kind of control does not necessarily come from mechanical hardware. It often comes from software. From the algorithms that manage the interaction between the combustion engine, the electrical motor, and the battery system. If Mercedes has truly mastered that interaction better than the rest of the grid, it would explain why the W17 looked so efficient in Melbourne. It would also explain why rival teams are suddenly paying very close attention to the data coming from that engine. Because if the advantage we saw in Australia is real, it could take months for other teams to fully understand how to replicate it. And that is exactly why the FIA's review of the Mercedes power unit data is now becoming such an important story. Because depending on what the governing body finds, the dominant performance we saw in Melbourne could turn out to be just the beginning of something much bigger in the 2026 championship.